Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin Saturday. Welcome to our program. Two great guests, Charlie Kirk, Turning Point USA. We look forward to exploring his role in the last election. And one of the most brilliant constitutional lawyers I've ever known, and I've known him for like 45 years. Was also a clerk on the Supreme Court and so forth, Arthur Ferguson, and you'll get to meet him and know him a little later. But before we get to that, the Senate has a role called the advice and consent role in confirming nominees that President Trump puts forward for these various cabinet positions. President Trump is putting together a team that he wants, that he believes in, to help him advance his promises, his principles, his policies that he campaigned on for half a year or longer and won a landslide promoting, a landslide from sea to shining sea. He should get his team. He should be able to populate the executive branch with the people he wants. The Democrat Party and some Republicans tried to sabotage his presidency in 2016 to prevent him from getting the team he wants. That's got to stop. I want to remind you, America, that 2/3 of the Senate who will be involved in this process didn't stand for election. They didn't stand in front of the voters. And they're sure damn glad they didn't. I promise you that. Because they too are responsible for open borders. They too are responsible for inflation and the price of food and gasoline. They too are responsible for underfunding our military, for preventing real judges from being confirmed instead of these radical activists. They have a role in what's been going on in this country. These 2/3 of the senators that weren't up for election. And they one day will be held to account. And they need to be held to account in this advise and consent process too. That is, they should not be free without criticism from we the people. Our eyes wide open, our voices heard. They shouldn't be free to sabotage the incoming president and the team that he's trying to put together, picking off one cabinet secretary potential after another or the attorney general. No, this is a team that President Trump is trying to put together to advance his agenda. And I would expect that the entrenched forces in Washington, whether it's the media, whether they're on Capitol Hill, whether they're in the bureaucracy or academia, to oppose them. I would expect them to attack them. And I would expect the Republican Party to steamroll these opponents. That's what has to be done if anything's going to get done in this country. And I will note that Donald Trump has picked so far vibrant, I put it down here myself, vibrant, young, accomplished team of cabinet secretaries and advisors. You know, we talk about all these old people in Washington, Biden and Pelosi and Schumer and on and on. Here's Donald Trump, 78 years old. You know what he says? I want a young, vibrant team of go-getters who can get the job done, who will do what needs to be done. He should be applauded for this. And we don't need any lectures from a Democrat Party that flopped tampon Tim on the nation like he was a legitimate vice presidential candidate, the biggest freak in the history of American politics in 1,000 different ways. He was qualified to be vice president. He's not qualified to be the janitor at the Department of Agriculture. And I like the janitor at the Department of Agriculture. And then they flop out there Harris, who's not qualified to be vice president, let alone president. And the American people knew it. And then they gave us Joe Biden, Dementia Joe, 5th stage of 7 stages of dementia, whose early record, his early career, the first 10 years in the Senate, was as a racist segregationist. And they're going to pass judgment on us. Bernie Sanders, who is a Stalinist Marxist, he's going to pass judgment. Chuck Schumer, who never worked a private job in his entire life. He gets out of law school. He's elected to the Assembly in Albany, in New York, elected to Congress, elected to the Senate. That's no Renaissance man. That's a long-in-the-tooth political hack. And we can go down the list. Nancy Pelosi, she's become filthy rich as a result of having been Speaker and so forth and so on. So these failures, these has-beens, these people of the past, these long-in-the-tooth Washington hangers-on, they're going to tell us who's qualified and not. There needs to be pushback here, folks. I want to remind you of something. John Kennedy's elected president, one of the youngest presidents in history, Theodore Roosevelt being another. Who does he appoint as his attorney general? His brother, Robert F. Kennedy. Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s father. He appoints Robert F. Kennedy. How old was Robert F. Kennedy? He was 35 years old. What was his legal experience? Barely any. But one of them he had on his resume was as a committee staff lawyer, you may have heard of him, to Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. Remember the McCarthy hearings? Remember how the liberals used to hate it? Well, Joe Kennedy, Sr., the patriarch of the family, he and Joe McCarthy were buddies. They were friends. And so Robert Kennedy gets his job on this committee, on the Senate, as a legal assistant, a staff assistant to McCarthy. That's pretty much his bona fides. And he's brothers with John Kennedy. He was the Attorney General at the age of 35. Anybody complaining about that? No. Donald Rumsfeld was chief of staff to Gerald Ford for a long period of time, but he was also a staffer in Congress a long time. He'd been a member of Congress. He served in the Navy from 54 to 60, various positions, all stateside and so forth, which is fine. He became the youngest defense secretary since we had a Defense Department. He was 43 years old. 43 years old. They didn't attack him. They didn't attack Robert Kennedy. No. James Madison was 36 years old when he was the key delegate to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. See this Constitution? It wouldn't have been possible without these delegates, obviously, but especially James Madison, 36. What did he know? Apparently he knew a lot. Thomas Jefferson was 33 when he wrote the first draft to the Declaration of Independence. I'd say he did a pretty damn good job, wouldn't you? The youngest justice to the Supreme Court ever nominated and confirmed with Joseph Story, one of the greatest associate justices in American history, a scholar who has written books that are still read today. 32 years old in 1812, one of the greatest. Barack Obama was elected president, very young man in his 40s. What was his experience? None, really. He had a communist guy who was one of his, helped raise him and so forth. He was into all the Islamists and so forth. What was his substantive accomplishments? Zero. I already talked about Joe Biden, but Joe Biden was elected to the Senate when he was 29. He was sworn in when he was 30. What were his accomplishments? Nothing. Constitution says the requirement is pretty low. You need to be a United States citizen or 30 years old to be a senator. You need to be a United States citizen or 25 years old to be a House member. We forget these things because of all these old people who've been running this government into the ground. They show up on TV, they got to spend, 5 hours putting makeup on them and so forth and so on. And they wind them up and push them out. What people are not saying, and what I want to underscore here, is Donald Trump's bringing in vibrant, young, talented, substantive, accomplished people to every one of these departments. Look at Mike Walz, national security, Green Beret. Look at what he's accomplished at a young age. It's absolutely incredible. And there are many others. Pete Hegseth. Oh, Pete. He was a commentator for Fox. That's a good thing. But he was a hell of a lot more than that. A lot more than their vice presidential nominee ever was, that's for sure. The man is a combat veteran. He's a retired lieutenant colonel. He served in Iraq and Afghanistan. He received medals. He's written books about the subject. He's talked about the subject. Don't give him the back of your hand. That's baloney, especially the media and the Democrat Party that push forward reprobates like Tim Walz. I don't want to hear about it. President of the United States has a lot to tackle. Disastrous immigration issues, disastrous economy, and this degrowth Marxist movement that is trying to destroy our automobiles, our economic system, your way of life, and your lifestyle. He's got to deal with that. He's got to deal with a judiciary that is loaded with radical leftist judges, thanks to Obama, Clinton, and Biden. He's got to deal with that. He's got to deal with this ubiquitous administrative state, this Leviathan that thinks it's in charge of we the people, and that are going to do everything they can to sabotage him. He's got to deal with government education in these public schools that is failing the American people because the alliance between two big unions, the Department of Education and the Democrat Party, these are all daunting challenges. Entitlements. I'm not saying eliminate Social Security and Medicare, but how do you strengthen those programs? Daunting, because the Democrats and the media, anytime you try and reform these programs to the benefit of the people who are on them and people coming on these programs, oh, you're trying to destroy them, because that's who they are, like the 2/3 of those senators I talked about. Our foreign policy's in a shambles. Our national security's in a shambles. He's got to stitch that all back together. and defending and preserving the Constitution of the United States, which he himself, Donald Trump, experienced what happens when the Bill of Rights are thrown out the window. Now, I want to remind you of something. This Constitution of yours was drafted and voted on in Philadelphia at the Constitutional Convention. It lasted, give or take, about 5 months in one of the hottest summers ever in Philadelphia. And they stayed there in secret until they finished it. And they voted on it and they passed it. Then they had to send it to the states for ratification. The state legislatures, in their own conventions, they debated it. It was quite an undertaking. But I want to tell you about some of the men who were at this Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. You with me? None of whom would probably get approved for anything by the current Senate of the United States, because they're so brilliant. They're so accomplished in the Senate of the United States, aren't they? No, they're not. Jonathan Dayton of New Jersey was 26 years old. John F. Mercer of Maryland was 28 years old. Richard Dobbs Speight of North Carolina was 29 years old. Charles Pinckney of South Carolina was 29 years old. William Davey of North Carolina was 30 years old. Alexander Hamilton, again, you libs love him, right? Hamilton the movie, Hamilton the play. But in any event, Hamilton, New York, was 30 years old. Nicholas Gilman of New Hampshire was 32. William Houston of Georgia was 32. Most of you have never heard of these men before. They created your Constitution, which is the glue that keeps this country together. All, not all, but tremendous number of them, very young men. Luther Martin, Maryland, 39. William Blount of North Carolina, 39. Now we get into the 40s. Oh, my God. Gunning Bedford Jr. of Delaware, 40. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, 41. William Houston of New Jersey, 41. James McClurg of Virginia, 41. William Patterson of New Jersey, 41. Richard Bassett of Delaware, 42. Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut, 42. This is an age, this 42 up to 50, maybe 39. These are the age of many of the people Donald Trump's picking for his cabinet. It's a good thing, not a bad thing. Here are the old ones. Ready? 50 or older. Hugh Williamson, North Carolina, 52. Robert Morris, Pennsylvania, 53. George Reed, Delaware, 53. John Blair, Virginia, 55. John Dickinson, Delaware, 55. George Washington, 55. Daniel of St. Thomas Jenifer, Maryland, 57. William Samuel Johnson, Connecticut, 59. Now we're getting into the real old ones. George Wyeth, Virginia, 61. George Mason, great man, Virginia, 62. William Livingston, New Jersey, 63. David Brearley, Maryland, 64. Roger Sherman, Connecticut, 66. And the oldest, Benjamin Franklin, 81. So other than Franklin, the oldest delegate to the Constitutional Convention was 66. Most of them were in their 30s. And they did a hell of a good job. Donald Trump deserves his team. As I said, they are young, they are experienced, they are substantive, they're vibrant, they're good communicators to the American people, and they have a massive job ahead of them. Isn't it time that the generation that has screwed this country, not the greatest generation, one of the most awful generations, the Biden generation, isn't it time that it passed to a new generation? And isn't it fantastic? Isn't it wonderful that Donald Trump recognizes this? That I've got to bring people in who aren't tarnished by what's been going on in Washington, D.C. for the last 100 years. That these are people that bring new experiences, that bring motivation, that bring energy. These are people of a generation who we're going to have to hand the ball to now. So why keep holding it back? Isn't it time that people who are in their 80s look back on their careers and go home and retire and hand it off to not even the next generation, the generation before that, because the 80s, they've been around a long time. The Pete Hegseths, the Mike Walzes, These are great young men and women who can do great things for America and do what the voters want them to do in that landslide election that took place. They keep giving us the same people with the same faces on TV, with the same complaints and the same arguments. It's time to move them out of the way. Send them out to pasture. Give them a watch, give them a medal, give them whatever they want. They'll have massive pensions so they know how to take care of themselves, and turn it over to a generation that has new ideas tied to old American principles. That's what Donald Trump's trying to do. All of his nominees should be taken as a package. They can go through their committees, but taken as a package, vote them up or vote them down. Let the chips fall where they may. And let's take the names down of the individuals who do not want a resurgence, a rebirth of America and the government that is supposed to represent us.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.